It's a sad day in the world of the sweet science because one of the biggest fights of the year has been canceled. No, not AJ and Usyk. No, not Canelo and Triple G. It's Jake Paul versus Hasim Rahman Jr. 1 week before the fight was supposed to happen at Madison Square Garden in New York City, it has now been canceled. Why? Well, that depends on who you ask. And we're going to break it down and figure out exactly what's next for Jake Paul right here on Fighting Words with me, Andreas Hale. All right, guys, so let's play the blame game and figure out who is at fault for Jake Paul versus Hasim Rahman Jr. not happening. According to Team Paul, Hasim Rahman Jr. stepped in on short notice when Tommy Fury pulled out, more on him later, and signed a contract to fight at 200 pounds. Now, Rahman Jr. normally fights at heavyweight and has fought as high as about 250, 260. A week and a half before the fight, Team Rahman says, "We ain't making this weight. Can we fight at 215 pounds? Paul's team says, "Paul's never fought over 200 pounds. Hell no. The fight is canceled." Who's to blame? UFC President Dana White said at the post-fight press conference at UFC 277 that the fight was canceled because they weren't selling enough tickets. Now, is there some credence to that? Maybe, but if you looked online, they sold about half of the seats heading into fight week. Now, with a fight like this, people normally walk up, so I don't expect them to cancel the fight because of low ticket sales. The weight was an issue, and that is according to both Rahman Jr. and Team Paul. Now, Rahman Jr. says Jake Paul's just a punk. He should have just stepped up and fought. That's not necessarily true. Jake Paul's not like a real boxer, even though we want to believe he is. He says he can beat Canelo and all this wild stuff. But the reality is that Jake Paul's not fighting a guy well above his weight and worried about hurting himself. So who is truly at fault? Tommy Fury. Here's why. Tommy Fury was supposed to fight Jake Paul last December. He pulled out due to an injury. Jake Paul had to get a replacement in Tyron Woodley and then knocked him out in their rematch. Then they rebooked the fight. Fury couldn't get into the States, and now they had to find another short notice opponent, and that happened to be Hasim Rahman Jr. Now here's the crazy thing. Part of the blame also has to fall on Team Paul, because when you got a short notice opponent who fights at heavyweight and you're asking him to squeeze down to such a low weight that he's never fought as a pro, what do you think is going to happen? Yes, Rahman Jr. is going to take the fight. It's the biggest payday he's ever had. Why wouldn't he try to get down to 200 pounds? But it's up to you because you're the attraction to make sure that your opponent is ready to fight. And he wasn't. But if it wasn't for Tommy Fury, he wouldn't be here to begin with. So I'm blaming Tommy Fury for all of this, and then Jake Paul's team for a little bit. Now, what's next for Jake Paul? Now, some people will say, well, rebook the Rahman fight. That ain't happening because Rahman already pulled out, and Jake Paul only got him because he was a replacement. I don't think anybody really wants to see that fight. Now, some people say Anderson Silva. I'd like to see it, but you got to kind of fight a real boxer sooner or later. I'm going to give you two options. One is Tommy Fury. Yes, I know he's pulled out twice, but can we finally get this fight done? I'll explain how we get there in just a second. And the other opponent is KSI, his longtime rival who beat his brother a few years back. Now look, the Tommy Fury fight, the best way to make this happen if Tommy Fury can't get in the States, take your ass overseas and fight. You could do maybe a small stadium show because KSI is also fighting overseas and he's been talking trash the entire time. So you book Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury in the UK, do a good amount of ticket sales. If you beat him, you come back to the States, you're a little bit bigger. You can do Anderson Silva. Maybe you fight KSI or you fight KSI. KSI's talking all this trash. He beat your brother. Listen, everybody's going to get on him because it's not a boxer, right? But you're trying to sell pay-per-views and tickets. Get this one out the way and do a quick turnaround. That's how you do it if you're Jake Paul, because that fight will do gangbusters. Jake Paul versus KSI will absolutely be huge. And a lot of people expect Jake Paul to win that fight because he's the better boxer. But after that, then you can go Tommy Fury. Or you could go Rahman Jr. Or you can find somebody else. But whatever it is that you do, those are the only two opponents, and both of them you should fight in the UK on pay-per-view. That's the best way to do it. But you sound off. You tell me who's at fault for all this madness, and you tell me who should Jake Paul fight. That is if you care, because if you're a real fight fan, some of y'all just be out there like, I don't give a damn about Jake Paul. I totally understand, but everything is pro wrestling, and Jake Paul is part of this. So leave your comments below. Make sure you subscribe. But until next time, we're out of here. Peace.